before we continue reading, I'd just like to turn your attention to one word in this translation. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character. The key word, noble. We will keep this in mind and we will return to it later on. So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. So let's take a look at the passage that we have just read. I have posted some questions which will stimulate our thoughts in the presence of God. Boaz tells Ruth, this kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men. What did Boaz mean by this? What was the earlier kindness Ruth had shown? She had left her father and mother, left her people, went with her mother-in-law to a strange land, a land where she will not be allowed to worship the God of Israel. Moabites were barred from entering the Lord's presence up to the 10th generation. So she would not be allowed. And if she got married to just anybody, say a fellow Moabite who also happened to be living in the land of Israel, then for 10 generations, they will not be allowed to enter into the tabernacle courtyard. In spite of all that, because her mother-in-law was old, Ruth accompanied her and took care of her. That was the kindness that she had shown earlier. This kindness, which she was showing in proposing to Boaz, was even greater than the former kindness. Because Boaz was very obviously a considerably older man. Number one, he addresses her consistently as daughter. Number two, he points out, you have not run after younger men. So obviously, Boaz was considerably older. The reason Ruth proposes to Boaz is because he was in a position to redeem her and her property. It would not only be hers, but also her mother-in-law's, so that her mother-in-law gets her husband's property. Ruth chooses not to run after younger men. It's a choice that she makes. And Boaz notes this and says, this kindness that you are showing is greater than the former kindness. All this that we are noting about Ruth, and as we shall shortly see much about Boaz, tells us what sort of people the people of God can be and should be. Don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor, says Boaz. Boaz is very particular that his reputation be safe among the people. If you remember, we had read that he was a man of standing. How important is your testimony before people? How important is the testimony of a child of God? Very important. For the simple reason that God's reputation in this world is tied up with our reputation. If you remember, when we were looking at Abraham, we read from Hebrews chapter 11, a verse which said, "Therefore God is not ashamed to be known as their God." So whenever God introduced himself to the children of Israel, he said, "I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." God's reputation in this world is tied up with his children. And therefore, we must be careful that when we lose our testimony, we do not end up disgracing God. Remember what the Lord said about the children of Israel. He said, "My name is being blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you." When David committed adultery, it was not a secret thing. Quite a few people were involved in the process. God told David, through the prophet Nathan, "Your actions have made us a laughing stock among the enemies of Israel." So we must be very careful about our reputation. Not for our sake, but for the Lord's sake. Secondly, when we lose our testimony, it causes other people also to stumble. So the Apostle Paul writes to Timothy and insists that he should be an example to the young people. Because you cannot just keep preaching to the young people. They don't listen. But they look at your life and scrutinize it. And if it is worth emulating, they emulate. Young people are natural hero worshippers. They are looking for a role model. But if someone whom they look up to stumbles and falls, then what a stumbling block that becomes for their own lives. So we must be careful, because often our actions can cause other people to do wrong. So Boaz is very careful. Says, "Don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor." But still, he does not send Ruth away until morning. In life, we often have to weigh two possible courses of action. If Ruth continued sleeping on the threshing floor, there is the risk that someone might walk in and find her there and become suspicious of what happened. Though nothing happened, that's how the world is. People easily draw conclusions which might not be true. There was always the risk of someone coming. But sending Ruth by herself in the middle of the night back to her mother-in-law's house was not a wise course of action either. Of course, Boaz could have accompanied her. But if anyone saw the two of them in the night, that might not help. So it was safer to have Ruth be there. So we must be wise and practical while mindful of the Lord's reputation and our testimony before the world. He also said, "Bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out." And when he did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." We continue reading chapter 4, verse 1. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat there. When the kinsman redeemer he had mentioned came along, Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Okay. So we read in verse 1 of chapter 4, meanwhile, even as Ruth was talking to her mother-in-law, Naomi, Boaz was already in the town making the necessary arrangements. That's the kind of man Boaz was. Why at the town gate? So a little bit of background here. You know, in those days, most towns had a wall around for protection. At the town gate, just on the inside and on the outside, there will be a bit of an open space. It was called the city square. So during the daytime, people will come over there. Those who have something to sell will put up stalls over there. And those who wish to buy, this is where you go to look for what you want to buy. Then there will be those who are available as labor, as masons, farm laborers. They will also go and stand, and people will come and hire them. But there was also another very important activity that took place over there. This was also where disputes between individuals and legal transactions took place. So the chief men of the town will sit over here and they will hear people, whatever they have to say, whether it is a complaint or it is a suggestion, any transaction. This is where you will also find authorities before whom the transaction can be notarized. And you will also find ready witnesses available for witnessing the transaction. Okay. So that's the reason why Boaz goes to the town gate. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here. And they did so. Then he said to the kinsman redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our brother Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. I will redeem it, the kinsman redeemer said. So, some questions to help us think, why 10? Have you ever thought, why did he take 10 people? So, the Jews thought that there was a biblical basis for the number 10. It comes from the prayer that Abraham prayed. Remember, he had prayed to the Lord, will not the judge of all the earth do right? If there are 50 righteous people in Sodom, will you sweep away even these 50 righteous along with all the wicked? The Lord said, no, for the sake of those 50, he will spare the city. Then Abraham asked, what if some are missing in the 50? And then back and forth, the conversation between Abraham and God goes on till finally they settle at the number 10. If there are 10 righteous men, okay. So for the Jew, that is how the 10 righteous men became very important. So even today, in any new locality, if there are 10 Jews, then they can start a synagogue. But if the number is less than 10, then they cannot start a synagogue. 10 righteous men, because the Jew thought he was righteous, because he kept the law. So that's the reason wherever a transaction had to be notarized, 10 people were required. Not there in the Bible as a requirement, but that is what became the Jewish practice down the centuries. Naomi's land has to be redeemed. What does it imply? It basically means that when Elimelech, Naomi, Kilian, and Mahlon left Bethlehem and went to Moab, they had either sold off their land or in their absence, the land had lapsed to the government because of non-payment of taxes. They were not there. Either one of the two. But in Israel, There was an understanding. If you read Deuteronomy chapter 20, the Lord tells the children of Israel, all the land is mine. You are but tenants and sojourners in it. So that was the Israeli perspective of land. It belonged to God and to no one else. Let me just read to you that verse. I did not post it. So Deuteronomy. I'll post it to you later. That is better. Not able to locate the verse. So the Lord said that the land belongs to me, so it cannot be sold. You are only a tenant. The land cannot be sold permanently. So the land remains within a family. If for any reason the owners had to sell off the land, then they had the right of redemption. When they had the means, they could buy back the land. The new owner could not refuse it. Or a close relative known as the kinsman redeemer could do this on their behalf, and the land can thus be redeemed. Chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabitess, you acquire the dead man's widow in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. This is a reference to levirate marriage, where a man died without having sons to carry out his name. His younger brother or a near kinsman would marry the widow and have children in the dead man's name. So they inherit the dead man's property. At this, the kinsman redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. Why? Simple. Those children born would also be his children and will lay claim to his property also. And that was not acceptable to the man. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it, he said. So, when the kinsman redeemer refused to redeem the land, this choice that he is making, was it an expression of personal interest, priorities, or kingdom priorities? He was thinking about himself only, right? Verses 7 and 8. Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transaction in Israel. Keep this in mind. We're going to return to it shortly. So the kinsman redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, and he removed his sandal. So this sandal removing business, let us see what it is all about. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 to 10. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of his town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, this is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. Okay? Or in other words, if a man died without children, it was his brother or suitable near relative duty to marry the woman. But if he did not wish to do it, meaning if he did not wish to fulfill his duty, this was a shameful thing. He was hauled up before the elders. If he was still stubborn, the widow was to spit on his face and take off his sandals. This was to be a humiliation for the man. Then his family will be referred to as the family of the unsandaled. It was a shameful matter. But by the time of the Ruth narrative, the practice was so widely prevalent in Israel. What was widely prevalent? The younger brother refusing to carry on the duty to the older brother's widow, and no kinsman being willing to carry on the duty. It had become so common that there was nothing shameful about the matter. This kinsman redeemer himself takes off his sandal and hands it over to Boaz. It had become the practice of sealing land transactions this way. How much society had changed. In the same way, even today, many of the things which were considered utterly shameful in the past, that people will not even dare to speak about these things in public, have now become so commonplace, so widely accepted, that there is nothing shameful. When it comes to homosexual relations, in many Western countries, children are taught in school it is okay to have a family where there are two fathers, or where the mother is a man or the father is a woman. Children are taught this in school. It is not only acceptable, but it is approved and taught. So, if today you refuse to accept a gay person because he is gay, you could be in trouble. So if you're a cake maker, for example, and two men are getting married or two women are getting married, and if you say you will not do it, they could complain to the police about you. And the court could actually force you to do. In the United States, a Christian judge actually resigned because she refused to conduct a gay wedding. She said, I'd rather resign than do this. But that's the choice today. It's become such an acceptable practice. There is something else which is happening now, which actually at least the leaders of the church should be familiar with and have strategies for dealing with the matter. There is this term called gender fluidity. You cannot force a person called a male or female in many of the countries. You may be genetically a male, but you can choose to behave like a woman. You can express whichever gender you feel